The red warning lights flashed across the bridge of the USS Liberty as Captain Jake Morrison stared at the massive holographic display before him. 3,000 enemy ships hung in space like a dark cloud, their hulls gleaming with alien metal, and energy weapons that could turn entire planets into ash. Jake had seen many battles in his 20 years of service, but nothing like this. "Sir, we're receiving a transmission from the lead vessel," reported Lieutenant Amy Ross from her communications station. Her voice carried the tension that everyone on the bridge felt. "It's on all frequencies, broadcasting to every human colony and Earth itself." Jake nodded grimly and straightened his uniform. "Put it through." The main screen flickered and displayed something that made several crew members step back in shock. The creature that appeared was easily 9 feet tall, covered in scales that shifted between deep purple and black. Its eyes burned like molten gold, and crystalline armor covered its massive frame. This was Emperor Vexler of the Zephyrian Galactic Empire, ruler of over 3,000 star systems. "Primitive humans," the Emperor's voice boomed through the ship's speakers, each word dripping with contempt. "I am Emperor Vexler, supreme ruler of the Zephyrian Empire. For 5,000 years, my people have brought order to the galaxy. We have conquered civilizations far more advanced than your pathetic species." Jake felt his jaw tighten as the alien continued its speech. Around him, his crew watched in stunned silence. "You have exactly 72 hours to surrender unconditionally," Vexler declared. "Lay down your primitive weapons. Submit to Imperial rule. Those who comply will be allowed to serve as workers in our mining colonies. Those who resist will be eliminated along with their entire bloodline." The transmission cut to show images of other worlds the Empire had conquered. Cities burned, populations fled in terror, and massive Zephyrian war machines marched across devastated landscapes. The message was clear: resistance meant death. "This is not a negotiation," the Emperor continued. "This is an ultimatum. You have 72 hours. When that time expires, my fleet will reduce your worlds to cosmic dust. Your species will be remembered only as another failed experiment in the galaxy's history." The transmission ended, leaving the bridge in dead silence. Jake looked around at his crew and saw fear in their eyes, but also something else: defiance. Humans had faced extinction before and survived. They would not bow to alien tyranny without a fight. "Get me Admiral Carter immediately," Jake ordered. "Emergency channel." Within minutes, Admiral Lisa Carter's face appeared on the screen. She was a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too many battles. Behind her, Jake could see the frantic activity of Earth's command center. "I assume you saw the transmission, Captain Morrison," she said without preamble. "Yes, ma'am. What are your orders?" Admiral Carter was quiet for a moment, then spoke with the voice of someone who had made an impossible decision. "We're not surrendering. Captain, President Blake has called an emergency session of the Global Defense Council. Every available ship is being recalled to Earth's defensive perimeter." Jake felt a mix of pride and terror. The human fleet consisted of barely 200 vessels, most of them outdated compared to alien technology. They would be fighting a force 15 times their size. "Ma'am, with respect, we don't stand a chance in a direct confrontation," said Commander Sarah Johnson, Jake's first officer. "Their ships are larger, faster, and more heavily armed." "I know the odds, Commander," Admiral Carter replied. "But we've analyzed their formation and tactics. They're used to fighting species that surrender at the first show of force. They've never faced an enemy that fights back with everything they have." The Admiral's expression softened slightly. "I won't lie to you, this may be humanity's last stand, but I'd rather die free than live as slaves to alien masters." As the transmission ended, Jake turned to address his crew. These men and women had families back on Earth, dreams and hopes for the future. Now they faced annihilation at the hands of an empire that saw them as nothing more than insects. "You heard the Admiral," Jake said. "We have 72 hours to prepare for the fight of our lives. I know many of you are scared. Hell, I'm scared too. But we're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for every human child who deserves to grow up free. In the depths of the ship, Dr. Peter Hayes worked frantically in his xenobiology lab. The military had given him access to every piece of intelligence they had on the Zephyrian Empire. Most of it was fragmentary, gathered from long-range observations and intercepted communications. Peter had spent his career studying alien life forms, but the Zephyrians were different. They were the first truly hostile species humanity had encountered, and they seemed almost impossibly advanced. Their technology was centuries ahead of human capabilities. Their empire spanned half the galaxy, and their military had never suffered a defeat. But Peter had noticed something odd in the intercepted communications. The Zephyrians spoke of their enemies in terms that suggested they had never engaged in close combat. Every battle they fought was won through superior firepower at long range. They seemed to have an almost pathological fear of physical contact. "Computer, analyze Zephyrian homeworld gravitational data," Peter commanded. The results made him pause. The Zephyrian homeworld had roughly 60% of Earth's gravity. If they had evolved in such conditions, their bones would be less dense, their muscles weaker. But that alone wouldn't explain their apparent aversion to close combat. Meanwhile, President Susan Blake sat in the Oval Office, surrounded by her top advisors. The weight of humanity's fate rested on her shoulders, and she felt every pound of it. "Madam President," said Secretary of Defense Robert Chun, "our analysts estimate we have less than a 5% chance of military victory. Perhaps we should consider negotiation." "Negotiation?" Blake's voice was sharp. "You heard their ultimatum. They're offering us slavery or death. Those aren't terms any free people can accept. But if we fight, we'll lose everything," Chun pressed. "At least some humans would survive under their rule." Blake stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city where millions of people went about their daily lives, unaware that their world might end in 3 days. "Mr. Chun, I've studied history. I know what happens to enslaved peoples. They lose their culture, their identity, their very humanity. Better to die free than live as cattle." As the hours ticked by, human forces across the galaxy prepared for war. On Mars, the orbital defense platforms charged their weapons. In the asteroid belt, mining stations were converted into makeshift fortresses. On the outer colonies, civilians evacuated while military personnel prepared for siege. But perhaps the most important preparation was happening in the minds of ordinary humans. Word of the ultimatum had spread despite government attempts to control the information. Instead of panic, something unexpected emerged: unity. Humans who had been divided by politics, religion, and nationality suddenly remembered that they were all part of the same species. The 72-hour countdown had begun, and with it, humanity's greatest test. President Susan Blake stood before the emergency session of the Global Defense Council, her face pale but determined. The massive conference room buzzed with tension as representatives from every human colony debated their response to the Zephyrian ultimatum. 48 hours remained before the alien fleet would attack. "We cannot win this war through force," argued Representative Marcus Webb from the Luna colony. "Their technology is centuries ahead of ours. We need to try diplomacy while we still can." Admiral Lisa Carter shook her head firmly. "Madam President, with respect to Representative Webb, you cannot negotiate with a bully who holds a gun to your head. The Zephyrians have made their position clear: submit or die." Blake raised her hand for silence. "I understand both perspectives, but I believe we must exhaust all options before we commit humanity to a war we cannot win. I'm sending Ambassador Chris Taylor to their flagship for negotiations." The room erupted in protests. General Patricia Stone stood up, her voice cutting through the noise. "Madam President, you're sending a man to his death. These aliens have shown no mercy to any species they've encountered." "Perhaps," Blake replied quietly. "But if there's even a small chance of avoiding the deaths of billions, we must try. Ambassador Taylor has volunteered for this mission." Chris Taylor was a career diplomat who had spent 30 years resolving conflicts between human colonies. He was a tall man with graying hair and kind eyes. Someone who believed that most problems could be solved through patient conversation and mutual understanding. Now he faced his greatest challenge. The shuttle carrying Taylor approached the Zephyrian flagship, a massive vessel that dwarfed even Earth's largest battleships. The alien ship was a work of dark art, all sharp angles and gleaming metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. As Taylor's shuttle docked, he felt the weight of his species' fate on his shoulders. Two Zephyrian guards escorted Taylor through corridors that seemed designed to intimidate. The walls were covered in what appeared to be battle trophies from conquered worlds. Weapons, artwork, and preserved remains of defeated enemies lined the pathway to the throne room. The throne room itself was enormous, with a ceiling that stretched up into darkness. At the far end, Emperor Vexler sat upon a throne made from some kind of crystalline material that pulsed with inner light. The Emperor looked even more imposing in person than he had on the transmission. His scales rippled with color changes that seemed to indicate his mood, and his golden eyes tracked Taylor's every movement. "So," Vexler's voice boomed across the chamber, "the pathetic humans send a negotiator. How amusing. Do you perhaps believe you have something to offer the mighty Zephyrian Empire?" Taylor stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture of respect. "Your Imperial Majesty, I come seeking a peaceful solution to our current situation. Surely there must be some arrangement that benefits both our peoples without unnecessary bloodshed." The Emperor's laugh was a sound like breaking glass. "Arrangement? You speak as if you are equals. Your species has existed for what, a few 100,000 years? My empire has ruled the galaxy for 50 centuries. You are insects before my power." "We may be young as a species," Taylor replied calmly, "but we have much to offer. Humans are skilled workers, innovative thinkers, and loyal allies. We could serve the Empire better as willing partners than as conquered slaves." Vexler leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You mistake my intentions, little human. I do not need your partnership. I do not need your skills. I need your submission and your resources. Your worlds will be stripped of their minerals. Your populations will work in my mines until they die. This is not a negotiation." Taylor felt his composure beginning to crack. He had expected arrogance, but the casual dismissal of human life was harder to bear than he had anticipated. "Your Majesty, surely you can see the waste in destroying a species that could contribute to your empire's growth?" "Waste?" The Emperor stood, his massive form casting a shadow over Taylor. "I will tell you what waste is. Waste is allowing inferior species to believe they have value. Waste is showing mercy to those who deserve none. You humans are a disease, spreading across worlds that should belong to your betters." The words hit Taylor like physical blows. He had spent his life believing that reason and compassion could solve any conflict. Now he faced an enemy who viewed his entire species as vermin to be exterminated. "Your empire may be vast," Taylor said, his voice rising despite his efforts to stay calm, "but it is built on the bones of innocent peoples. How many civilizations have you destroyed? How many children have died for your glory?" Vexler's scales shifted to a deep red color. "Children? You speak of children as if they matter. The strong survive and the weak perish. This is the law of the universe. Your human sentiment is exactly why your species deserves extinction." "We are not weak," Taylor shot back. "We are not pathetic worms who bow to tyrants. We are human beings with dignity and worth, and we will not surrender to a monster like you." The Emperor's eyes blazed with fury. "Monster? You dare call me a monster? I am a god compared to your wretched kind. I have conquered worlds while your ancestors were still learning to make fire. I have destroyed civilizations that were ancient when your son was young." Something snapped inside Taylor. All his years of diplomatic training, all his belief in peaceful solutions, crumbled in the face of such absolute evil. This creature would never show mercy, would never be reasoned with, would never see humans as anything more than obstacles to be removed. "You want to know what I think of your mighty empire?" Taylor said, his voice deadly quiet. I think you're nothing but a bully who preys on the weak. I think your empire is built on fear because, deep down, you know you're not as strong as you pretend to be. Vexler roared in rage and stepped down from his throne, towering over the human ambassador. You will kneel before me, insect. You will. Beg for your worthless life, and I will still order your planet burned to ash. Taylor looked up at the alien emperor, at this creature who had sentenced his entire species to death, and felt something he had never experienced before. Pure, righteous anger flooded through him. Without thinking, without considering the consequences, he drew back his hand and delivered a sharp slap across Vexler's scaled face. The sound echoed through the throne room like a thunderclap. For a moment, everything was silent. Then Emperor Vexler let out a scream that seemed to come from the depths of his being. The mighty ruler of 3,000 star systems collapsed to the floor. Writhing in apparent agony, the effect on the Zephyrian guards was immediate and catastrophic. They had never seen their emperor injured, had never witnessed their invincible leader reduced to a writhing mass on the floor. Panic spread through their ranks like wildfire. Some fled in terror, others fired their weapons wildly, and a few simply stood frozen in shock. Taylor stared in amazement at what he had done. A simple slap, something that would barely register as violence between humans, had brought down the most powerful being in the galaxy. He had no idea what this meant or what would happen next, but he knew that everything had changed in that single moment. The war between humanity and the Zephyrian Empire had begun not with massive fleets and planet-killing weapons, but with one man's refusal to bow to evil and a slap that shook the foundations of galactic power. Dr. Peter Hayes stared at the emergency transmission from Ambassador Taylor's shuttle in complete disbelief. The video showed the Zephyrian throne room in chaos, with alien guards running in terror while their emperor writhed on the floor like he had been hit by a plasma cannon. But all Taylor had done was slap him. "Play it again," Peter commanded his computer. He watched the sequence once more, analyzing every detail. The moment Taylor's hand made contact with Vexler's face, the Emperor's entire body went rigid before collapsing. The reaction was far too extreme for what should have been a minor physical contact. Peter had spent the last 2 days studying every piece of intelligence on Zephyrian biology, and now the pieces were falling into place. He rushed to his analysis station and began pulling up files on the alien homeworld. "Computer, display gravitational data for the Zephyrian homeworld," he said urgently. The holographic display showed a planet roughly the size of Earth but with significantly lower gravity. Peter's eyes widened as he realized the implications. Display atmospheric composition and geological structure. The results confirmed his growing theory. The Zephyrian homeworld was geologically stable with minimal seismic activity. The atmosphere was thick and provided natural cushioning. Most importantly, the planet's ecosystem showed no evidence of large predators or species that engaged in physical combat. They evolved without violence, Peter whispered to himself. No wonder they use energy weapons exclusively. His hands flew across his workstation as he compiled his findings. The Zephyrian nervous system had developed in an environment where physical contact was rare and gentle. Their scales, which appeared to be armor, were actually hypersensitive nerve clusters. What humans considered a light touch would register as intense pain to a Zephyrian. The laboratory door burst open and Admiral Carter rushed in, followed by several military officers. "Dr. Hayes, we need answers now. Half the enemy fleet is retreating, but the other half is advancing on Earth. What happened to their emperor?" Peter turned to face the group, his excitement barely contained. "Admiral, I believe I've discovered something that changes everything. The Zephyrians are not the invincible warriors they appear to be. They're actually incredibly fragile." "Fragile?" General Stone stepped forward. "Doctor, we've seen their ships destroy entire planets. How can they be fragile?" "Not their technology," Peter explained quickly. "Their biology, look at this data." He gestured to the holographic display showing the Zephyrian homeworld. They evolved on a low-gravity world with no natural predators. Their entire physiology is adapted for a gentle environment. Admiral. Carter studied the data with growing understanding. You're saying they can't handle physical contact? Exactly. Their nervous system is designed for their homeworld conditions. What we consider normal human interaction is like torture to them. Ambassador Taylor's slap would have felt like being hit by a sledgehammer? The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Colonel Mike Turner, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. If that's true, then their entire military doctrine makes sense. They fight from a distance because they have to. They can't engage in close combat. We need to verify this, Admiral Carter said. Colonel Turner, I want you to take a small reconnaissance team to their outer perimeter. Test this theory, but be careful. We don't want to start a massacre. 2 hours later, Colonel Turner and his team approached a disabled Zephyrian scout ship in their stealth fighter. The alien vessel had been damaged in the chaos following the Emperor's collapse and was drifting powerless in space. Remember, Turner spoke into his comm unit, we're not here to harm them. We need to understand their limitations. The team docked with the alien ship and made their way through the corridors. The interior was designed for beings much larger than humans, with soft surfaces and rounded edges everywhere. It was like walking through a giant nursery. They found 3 Zephyrian crew members, huddled in what appeared to be their command center. The aliens were clearly terrified, their scales shifting through various colors that probably indicated fear. We are not here to hurt you, Turner said slowly, hoping they had translation devices. We want to understand. One of the Zephyrians spoke in broken English. Please do not touch us. We surrender. We will leave your space. Turner exchanged glances with his team. The fear in the alien's voice was genuine. These creatures who belonged to an empire that had conquered thousands of worlds were terrified of humans. Why are you afraid? Turner asked gently. You're kind. Your kind hurts with touch. We saw the Emperor. We saw what your ambassador did. We cannot fight your touching weapons. Turner realized they thought the slap was some kind of advanced human weapon. We don't have touching weapons. Our ambassador was just angry. The Zephyrian's eyes widened in terror. Just angry? You can do that when just angry? How do you fight when you are truly trying to hurt? The revelation hit Turner like a physical blow. These aliens genuinely believe that humans possess some kind of devastating contact-based weaponry. They had no concept that what happened to their emperor was the equivalent of a human being mildly annoyed. Back on Earth, Dr. Hayes was presenting his findings to the Global Defense Council. The assembled representatives listened in stunned silence as he explained the biological differences between humans and Zephyrians. Their entire empire is built on the fear of other species, Hayes concluded. They use overwhelming technological superiority to avoid close combat because they physically cannot survive it. A human child could incapacitate a Zephyrian warrior with a gentle push. President Blake looked around the room at her advisors. Are you saying we've been afraid of an empire that's more fragile than we are? In terms of physical confrontation, yes, Hayes replied. But we must remember they still have superior technology and numbers. This discovery gives us an advantage, but we must use it wisely. General Stone was already thinking tactically. If they can't handle physical contact, then traditional boarding actions would be incredibly effective. We could take their ships with minimal casualties. But that's just the beginning, Dr. Hayes continued. I've been analyzing their communications intercepts. The entire Zephyrian social structure is based on the concept of physical invulnerability. Their emperor was seen as a godlike figure who could never be harmed. When Ambassador Taylor slapped him, it didn't just hurt Vexler physically. It shattered the fundamental belief system of their entire civilization. Admiral Carter leaned forward. What do you mean? Think about it. Every species they've conquered saw their emperor as invincible. When word spreads that a human defeated him with a simple slap, it will cause revolts throughout their empire. Their authority was based on fear, and that fear is now broken. As if to confirm Hayes' words, intelligence reports began streaming in from across the galaxy. On dozens of worlds, species that had been enslaved by the Zephyrians were rising up. The news of the Emperor's humiliation had spread faster than the Empire could contain it, Commander Sarah Johnson monitoring the communications, looked up with amazement. We're getting reports of uprisings on over 50 worlds. The Zephyrian governors are abandoning their posts. Some are even surrendering to the local populations. The room erupted in excited conversation. What had seemed like humanity's darkest hour was transforming into something unprecedented. A single act of human defiance had not only revealed the weakness of their enemies, but had sparked a galactic revolution. President Blake stood up, her voice carrying new confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, we have an opportunity to do more than just survive this war. We have a chance to liberate the galaxy from tyranny. But we must act quickly and wisely. Dr. Hez, I want you to prepare detailed briefings on Zephyrian biology for all our military units. We're going to need every advantage we can get. As the meeting disbanded, Peter Hayes remained in his laboratory, continuing his research. He had unlocked the secret that would change the course of the war, but he knew the hardest part was still ahead. Humanity would need to learn how to use their newfound advantage without becoming the very monsters they sought to defeat. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Defiance, watching the tactical display as his small strike force approached the Zephyrian homeworld. 2 days had passed since Ambassador Taylor's slap had brought down Emperor Vexthor, and the alien empire was collapsing faster than anyone had imagined possible. Sir, we're receiving multiple surrender signals from the orbital defense platforms, reported Lieutenant Amy Ross. It appears they're abandoning their positions. Jake nodded grimly. Intelligence reports from across the galaxy painted the same picture everywhere. The mighty Zephyrian Empire was crumbling as news of their emperor's defeat spread. But Jake knew that cornered enemies were often the most dangerous. Maintain course, he ordered. We need to reach the Imperial Palace before they have time to regroup. Behind him, Commander Sarah Johnson reviewed the mission briefings Dr. Hayes had prepared. The biological data on Zephyrian physiology was almost hard to believe. These creatures who had terrorized the galaxy for centuries were so fragile that a firm handshake could hospitalize them. Captain, Sarah said quietly, I've been thinking about what Dr. Hayes discovered. If the Zephyrians are this vulnerable to physical contact, how did they ever develop space travel? How did they build an empire? Jake had wondered the same thing. Maybe that's exactly why they became so technologically advanced. They had to develop tools and weapons that let them work without touching anything directly. The strike force consisted of 12 ships, each carrying specially trained boarding teams. Admiral Carter had handpicked volunteers who understood the delicate nature of their mission. They were not going to slaughter helpless aliens, but they needed to demonstrate human capabilities to prevent further aggression. As they entered the Zephyrian system, the sight that greeted them was shocking. The once mighty home fleet was scattered and disorganized. Many ships were broadcasting surrender signals, while others seemed to be fleeing toward the outer system. The famous Zephyrian military discipline had completely collapsed. This is almost too easy, muttered Sergeant Danny Brooks, leader of the first boarding team. It feels like we're taking advantage of children. Jake understood the feeling. Every human military officer had been trained to respect their enemies and fight with honor. But they also had to remember that these same children had been preparing to commit genocide against humanity just days earlier. Remember your orders, Jake announced over the ship's communications. We're here to neutralize their military capability, not to harm innocent beings. Use minimum force necessary. The first target was a Zephyrian battlecruiser that had been disabled by its own crew rather than face human boarding parties. As the Defiance approached, Jake could see alien figures moving frantically behind the ship's transparent sections. They were clearly terrified. Docking successful, reported the pilot. All teams ready for boarding. Danny Brooks led his team through the docking tube and into the alien vessel. The first thing that struck him was how quiet it was. On human ships, there was always the sound of machinery, ventilation systems, and crew members going about their duties. This ship felt almost dead. They found the first group of Zephyrians in what appeared to be their command center. The aliens were huddled together in a corner, their scales shifting through colors that probably indicated extreme fear. When they saw the humans approaching, several of them collapsed completely. "Please," one of them spoke in heavily accented English, "we surrender. Do not use your touching weapons on us." Danny realized they still believed that human physical contact was some kind of advanced weapon technology. He stopped several feet away and raised his hands to show he meant no harm. "We're not here to hurt you," he said gently. "We need you to power down your weapon systems and surrender control of your ship." The lead Zephyrian, who wore what appeared to be officer markings, trembled as he spoke. You will not touch us, even though we are your enemies?" "We are not monsters," Danny replied. "We don't hurt prisoners who surrender peacefully." The alien's relief was visible. With shaking hands, he began operating the ship's controls. Within minutes, the battlecruiser's weapons were offline and its shields were down. The most advanced warship in the Zephyrian fleet had been captured by a boarding party of 12 humans, who had not fired a single shot. Similar scenes played out across the fleet. Ship after ship surrendered without resistance as human boarding. Parties demonstrated their ability to move freely through Zephyrian vessels. The psychological effect was devastating. These aliens, who had conquered thousands of worlds through superior technology, were helpless against an enemy that could simply walk up and touch them. On the planet's surface, the Imperial Palace was in chaos. Emperor Vexler remained unconscious, his body still recovering from the trauma of physical contact. The Imperial Council was meeting in emergency session, trying to decide how to respond to the human invasion. "We must evacuate the Emperor immediately," declared General Koroth, the highest-ranking military officer still loyal to the Empire. "The humans are monsters who use pain touch as a weapon. We cannot allow them to capture him." "But where can we go?" asked Councillor Velek. "The entire Empire is in revolt. Half our worlds have declared independence, and the other half are too afraid to resist the humans." The discussion was interrupted by reports from the orbital defense grid. Human ships were approaching the planet, and the defense platforms were surrendering without firing a shot. The homeworld of the mighty Zephyrian Empire was about to fall to a force smaller than a single Imperial battle group. Meanwhile, Dr. Jennifer Ward was analyzing the psychological impact of the human advance from her position aboard the command ship. As a military psychologist, she had studied the effects of warfare on different species, but nothing had prepared her for what she was seeing. "Admiral Carter," she reported over the communication link, "the Zephyrian military is experiencing what I can only describe as collective psychological collapse. They're not just afraid of us physically. They're afraid of the very concept of what we represent." "Explain," Carter's voice came through the speaker. "Their entire worldview was based on the idea that the strong naturally dominate the weak through superior technology and intimidation. They never developed concepts like courage, sacrifice, or fighting against impossible odds because they never had to. When humans refused to surrender and then demonstrated the ability to defeat their emperor through simple physical contact, it shattered their understanding of how the universe works. The implications were staggering. The Zephyrian Empire had not just lost a battle or even a war. They had lost their entire sense of identity and purpose. For a species that had defined itself through dominance over others, the discovery that they were physically inferior to their intended victims was catastrophic. Captain Morrison's strike force reached the Imperial Palace without encountering any resistance. The massive structure, which had been built to intimidate visitors from conquered worlds, now seemed pathetically vulnerable. Human soldiers walked through corridors that had once echoed with the footsteps of emperors, while alien servants fled in terror at their approach. When they reached the throne room where Ambassador Taylor had delivered his famous slap, they found it empty except for a few maintenance workers who immediately surrendered. The crystalline throne sat abandoned, its inner light dimmed as if reflecting the fall of its occupant. "Sir," reported Sergeant Brooks, "we've secured the palace. No casualties on either side. The Zephyrians are so afraid of us that they're surrendering." At the first sight of human soldiers, Jake felt a mixture of triumph and sadness. They had achieved what seemed impossible just days earlier, but the cost to the Zephyrian people was becoming clear. An entire civilization was collapsing because they had never learned to cope with defeat. As human forces established control over the Zephyrian homeworld, reports continued to stream in from across the galaxy. The empire that had taken 5,000 years to build was disintegrating in a matter of days. Species that had been enslaved for centuries were throwing off their chains, and Zephyrian governors were abandoning their posts in panic. The galaxy was free, but now humanity faced a new challenge. What would they do with the power they had unexpectedly gained? The answer to that question would determine whether they became liberators or simply replaced one tyranny with another. Emperor Vexler slowly opened his golden eyes in the medical chamber deep within the imperial palace. 3 days had passed since the human ambassador had struck him, and his body still trembled from the memory of that terrible contact. The scales along his face remained tender, and every slight movement sent waves of discomfort through his nervous system. "My emperor," whispered Dr. Zethus, the royal physician, "you must remain still. Your neural pathways are still recovering from the trauma." Vexler tried to speak, but found his voice weak and raspy. The humans, where are they?" Dr. Zethus exchanged worried glances with the guards standing nearby. "My emperor, they have taken the palace. Their forces control the capital city. We managed to move you to this secure medical facility before they arrived." The news hit Vexler like another physical blow. His mighty empire, built over 5 millennia, had fallen to a species he had dismissed as primitive insects. "How many ships do they have in orbit?" 12, my emperor," replied General Koroth, stepping forward from the shadows. "Only 12 ships defeated our entire home fleet." Vexler's mind reeled. 12 ships against thousands, and the humans had won. "Our fleet... Did they fight? They... They surrendered, my emperor. When the humans demonstrated their ability to board our vessels and use their touching weapons, our crews could not resist. Many ships fled to the outer system, others simply powered down their weapons." The emperor closed his eyes in despair. He had spent his entire life believing in Zephyrian superiority, in the natural right of his species to rule over others. Now he discovered that a single human could defeat him with a gesture that they probably considered trivial. What of the Empire? What of our colonies? General Koroth's scales shifted to dark colors indicating deep distress. "My emperor, we have lost contact with over 2,000 worlds. The provincial governors are either in revolt or have abandoned their posts. The species we conquered are declaring independence faster than we can track." Vexler struggled to sit up despite the pain. "We must strike back. Gather what forces remain loyal. Use our most powerful weapons against their homeworld." "With respect, my emperor," Dr. Zethus interrupted, "you are in no condition to lead a military campaign. The trauma you suffered has affected your entire nervous system. You need weeks of recovery time." "Weeks?" Vexler's voice rose to a roar, then he collapsed back as the effort sent fresh waves of pain through his body. "We don't have weeks. Every day we delay, more worlds slip away from our control." Meanwhile, Admiral Lisa Carter stood in the captured Zephyrian Command Center, watching reports stream in from across the galaxy. The speed of the Empire's collapse was almost frightening. Species that had been enslaved for centuries were not just declaring independence, but were actively hunting down their former oppressors. "Admiral," reported Captain Amy Ross, "we're receiving distress calls from Zephyrian civilians on dozens of worlds. Some of the liberated species are getting revenge." Carter's expression darkened. "What kind of revenge?" "Nothing fatal, but they're using the same tactic we accidentally discovered. Physical contact. On some worlds, former slaves are simply touching their former masters, knowing it will incapacitate them." The irony was not lost on Carter. Humanity had intended to fight a defensive war, but their discovery of Zephyrian vulnerability had unleashed a galactic revolution that was spiraling beyond anyone's control. "Get me President Blake immediately," Carter ordered. "We need to discuss our next moves carefully." Within the hour, an emergency council meeting was taking place via secure transmission between Earth and the occupied Zephyrian capital. President Blake's image appeared on the main screen, surrounded by her advisors. Admiral Carter, what's the current situation? Madam President, the Zephyrian Empire has effectively ceased to exist as a functioning government. Emperor Vexther is alive but incapacitated. Their military has either surrendered or fled. However, we're facing a new problem. Blake leaned forward. What problem? The power vacuum we've created is causing chaos across the galaxy. Some liberated species are seeking revenge against their former oppressors. Others are fighting among themselves for territory. We may have stopped one war only to start dozens of smaller ones. Dr. Jennifer Ward, who had been monitoring the psychological effects of the conflict, joined the conversation. Madam President, we're dealing with thousands of species who have never known freedom. They don't have the political structures or experience to govern themselves peacefully. Are you suggesting we become the new Galactic Empire? Blake asked pointedly. No, Ward replied quickly. But we may need to provide temporary stability while these civilizations learn to govern themselves. The discussion was interrupted when Captain Morrison approached Admiral Carter with urgent news. Admiral, we've intercepted communications from the remaining Zephyrian fleet. They're planning a desperate attack on Earth. Carter turned to the screen. Madam President, we may have one more battle to fight. The Zephyrian fleet that assembled for the final assault was a shadow of the mighty armada that had originally threatened humanity. Only about 300 ships remained under Imperial control, many of them damaged and undermanned. General Koroth had taken command in the Emperor's absence, driven by a desperate need to restore Zephyrian honor. All ships maintain maximum distance from the human vessels, Koroth commanded from his flagship. We cannot allow them to board us. Use long-range weapons only. The Zephyrian plan was simple, but flawed. They would attack Earth's orbital defenses, with concentrated firepower while staying far enough away to prevent human boarding actions. What they failed to understand was that human tactics had already adapted to their enemy's limitations. Admiral Carter met the alien fleet with only 50 human ships, but her strategy was unlike anything the Zephyrians had ever encountered. Instead of engaging in traditional ship-to-ship combat, the human vessels used their superior maneuverability to close distance rapidly. All boarding teams prepare for immediate assault, Carter commanded. Target their command ships first. The battle was unlike any in galactic history. Human ships darted between the larger Zephyrian vessels like angry insects, docking wherever they could find purchase. Within minutes, boarding parties were moving through alien corridors while the terrified crews either fled or surrendered. Sergeant Danny Brooks found himself aboard General Koroth's flagship, leading his team toward the bridge. The Zephyrian crew they encountered along the way simply collapsed at the sight of humans, too frightened to even attempt resistance. This doesn't feel like victory, muttered one of Brooks' soldiers. It feels like we're bullying children. Brooks understood the feeling, but he also remembered the original Zephyrian ultimatum. These children were planning to commit genocide against our entire species. Never forget that. When they reached the bridge, they found General Koroth standing alone beside his command chair. The Zephyrian officer's scales were shifting through rapid color changes, indicating what appeared to be a mixture of fear and desperate determination. I will not surrender to touching weapon wielders, Koroth declared, though his voice shook with terror. I will die before I submit to inferior beings. Brooks approached slowly, his hands visible and non-threatening. General, your emperor has already fallen. Your empire has collapsed. There's no shame in surrendering to save the lives of your remaining crews. Shame? Koroth's voice rose. My people have ruled the galaxy for 5,000 years. We brought order to chaos, civilization to barbarian worlds. And now we are defeated by creatures who use pain touch as a weapon? We don't use touch as a weapon, Brooks explained patiently. We're just built differently than you are. What seems like an attack to you is normal interaction for us. The revelation seemed to break something inside Koroth. His legs gave way, and he collapsed into his command chair, the fight going out of him completely. If that is true, then we have been living a lie our entire history. We believed we were strong, but we are the weakest beings in the galaxy. Within hours, the last organized Zephyrian military force had surrendered. The empire that had dominated half the galaxy for millennia was officially dead. But as human forces took control of the situation, they faced a new and unexpected challenge: what to do with the freedom they had won for countless civilizations. Reports continued to flood in from across the galaxy. Some liberated worlds were establishing peaceful governments, others were descending into civil war. Former slave species were fighting among themselves, while Zephyrian civilians lived in terror of revenge attacks. President Blake realized that humanity's greatest test was not the war they had just won, but the peace they would have to build from the ashes of galactic tyranny. Emperor Vexler stood in the ruins of his throne room, his once mighty form now appearing frail and broken. The crystalline throne that had symbolized 5,000 years of Zephyrian dominance sat cracked and dim, its inner light extinguished like the empire itself. Around him, the palace that had once hosted the surrender of countless civilizations was now occupied by human soldiers who moved with quiet efficiency. 2 weeks had passed since the final battle above Earth, and the reports from across the galaxy painted a picture of complete collapse. The Zephyrian Empire, which had seemed invincible just days before, no longer existed. Vexler's scales had lost their vibrant colors, now appearing dull and gray like his prospects for the future. "My Emperor," whispered Dr. Zethus, the only advisor who had remained loyal to the end. "The human president has agreed to receive your transmission. The communication channel is ready." Vexler nodded slowly, each movement still causing him discomfort from the trauma of Ambassador Taylor's slap. The very thought of that moment filled him with a mixture of pain and humiliation that he had never experienced before. He had been a god emperor, untouchable and supreme, and a single human gesture had reduced him to this broken creature. "Leave me," he commanded softly. "This is something I must do alone." As Dr. Zethus departed, Vexler approached the communication console with unsteady steps. He had rehearsed the words he would speak, though they tasted like poison in his mouth. Never in Zephyrian history had an emperor begged for mercy from a conquered species. But then again, he was no longer truly an emperor. The screen flickered to life, showing President Susan Blake sitting in what appeared to be the human seat of government. Behind her, Vexler could see other humans, including the military officers who had orchestrated his empire's downfall. But it was the presence of Ambassador Chris Taylor that made Vexler's nervous system spike with remembered pain. "Emperor Vexler," President Blake said with formal politeness, "you requested this communication." Vexler struggled to find his voice. Speaking to beings he had once considered insects was harder than any battle he had ever fought. "President Blake of the human species," he began, his words careful and measured, "I come before you not as a conqueror, but as a defeated leader seeking mercy for my people." The admission hung in the air like a death sentence. Blake's expression remained neutral, but Vexler could see the barely contained emotions in the faces of the other humans. They had every right to demand his death and the destruction of his species. "I have watched my empire crumble in the span of days," Vexler continued, his voice growing stronger despite his physical weakness. "Worlds that served the Zephyrian, crowned for millennia, have declared independence. Species that once knelt before our might now hunt my people through the stars. The great civilization I inherited from my ancestors has become nothing more than scattered refugees fleeing across the galaxy." President Blake leaned forward slightly. "And why should humanity show mercy to a species that threatened to commit genocide against us?" The question struck Vexler like another physical blow. He had no right to ask for mercy, no logical argument that could justify what his empire had planned to do to humanity. But he had to try, not for himself, but for the millions of Zephyrian civilians who had never participated in the Empire's crimes. "Because," Vexler said, his voice breaking slightly, "you are better than we ever were. In all our conquests, in all our victories, we never showed mercy to the defeated. We enslaved or destroyed every species that opposed us, but you have the power to exterminate my people completely, yet you choose restraint. Blake's expression softened almost imperceptibly. What exactly are you asking for, Emperor? I am asking you to spare my people, Vexter replied, his pride finally crumbling completely. I offer the unconditional surrender of all remaining Zephyrian forces. I renounce all claims to imperial authority. I will submit to whatever punishment you deem appropriate for my crimes against your species and countless others. But please, I beg you, do not let my failures doom innocent Zephyrians to extinction. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Vexter watched the humans confer quietly among themselves, probably deciding the fate of his entire species. He noticed that Ambassador Taylor whispered something to President Blake, and for a moment, Vexter wondered if the man who had brought down an empire with a single slap would now advocate for its complete destruction. Emperor Vexter, Blake finally spoke, humanity will accept your surrender. However, our terms are not negotiable. Vexter felt a mixture of relief and dread. I will accept any terms you impose. First, all Zephyrian military forces will disarm immediately and submit to human oversight. Second, your species will provide full reparations to every civilization you have wronged, to the extent of your ability. Third, you personally will stand trial for crimes against sentient beings, though the court will be composed of representatives from all affected species, not just humans. The terms were harsh but fair, Vexter realized. He had expected death or enslavement. And what of my people? What of Zephyrian civilians? Your people will be relocated to a suitable world where they can live in peace under the protection of a new Galactic Council, Blake continued. They will be free to maintain their culture and traditions, but they will never again hold dominion over other species. Vexter's knees nearly gave way with relief. His people would survive. It was more than he had dared to hope for. I accept these terms completely and without reservation. President Blake nodded. There is one more condition. Ambassador Taylor will return to formalize the surrender treaty. The mention of Taylor's name sent another wave of nervous system distress through Vexter's body, but he forced himself to remain standing. I understand. I will receive your ambassador with all the respect and protocol due to a representative of the victorious power. As the transmission ended, Vexter collapsed into his broken throne, overwhelmed by emotions he had never experienced before. Relief, gratitude, and shame warred within him as he contemplated the future. His empire was gone, his power was broken, but his species would survive. 3 days later, Ambassador Chris Taylor returned to the Zephyrian throne room under very different circumstances. This time, he was accompanied by a full diplomatic delegation and an honor guard of human soldiers. The throne room had been cleaned and prepared for the ceremony, though the cracks in the crystalline throne remained as a permanent reminder of how quickly power could crumble. Emperor Vexter, dressed in simple robes rather than his imperial armor, waited at the bottom of the throne room steps. As Taylor approached, Vexter carefully lowered himself to his knees, a gesture of submission that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. Ambassador Taylor, Vexter said, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness, I formally surrender myself and all remaining Zephyrian forces to human authority. I acknowledge the crimes of my empire and accept whatever justice you deem appropriate. Taylor looked down at the fallen emperor, this being who had once threatened to destroy humanity completely. There was no satisfaction in seeing a once mighty ruler reduced to begging, only sadness for the waste of so many lives and civilizations. Rise, Vexter, Taylor said gently. You are no longer an emperor, but you are still a sentient being deserving of dignity. As Vexter stood, Taylor extended his hand in the traditional human gesture of greeting. The Zephyrian instinctively flinched, expecting pain, but Taylor's touch was gentle and brief. It was a symbolic moment that representatives from dozens of species witnessed. The man whose slap had toppled an empire now offering reconciliation rather than revenge. The formal treaty was signed within the hour, officially ending the Zephyrian empire and establishing the framework for a new galactic government. Representatives from liberated worlds spoke of justice and rebuilding, while Zephyrian delegates promised cooperation and reparations. In the months that followed, the galaxy began the long process of healing. The new Galactic Council established its headquarters on a neutral world, with humans serving as peacekeepers and mediators rather than rulers. Species that had been enemies for millennia learned to work together, united by their shared experience of liberation. Dr. Peter Hayes published his research on Zephyrian biology, ensuring that the galaxy understood the biological factors that had led to the Empire's rapid collapse. His work became the foundation for new diplomatic protocols that took into account the physical and psychological differences between species. Emperor Vexler was tried by a tribunal of representatives from affected worlds and sentenced to life imprisonment, though his conditions were humane. He spent his remaining years writing the true history of the Zephyrian Empire, documenting its crimes and serving as a witness to the dangers of unchecked power. Ambassador Chris Taylor became the first director of the Galactic Peacekeeping Force, dedicated to preventing any single species from ever again dominating others through fear and violence. The man who had accidentally started a revolution with a single slap became a symbol of both human restraint and the power of standing up to tyranny.